Yali Madat, everyone. My name is Maria Budhwani, and I will be moderating this evening's session. It is my immense pleasure to welcome you to ITREB USA's third national webinar series, Aspire. ITREB USA's Aspire webinar series aims to explore topics relating faith and world in the current times we find ourselves in, and to provide avenues for thoughtful reflection and inspiration. Today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Amyn Sajoo as our lecturer. Dr. Sajoo lectures in human rights and global politics at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, where he is also a scholar in residence at the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies. Dr. Sajoo's current research focuses on the ethics of citizenship, public religion, including issues in modern bioethics. Dr. Sajoo's early career was with the Canadian Department of Justice and Foreign Affairs in Ottawa. He then served as the Canada Fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, with fieldwork in Indonesia and Malaysia. This was followed by affiliations at Cambridge and McGill Universities and the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London. As many of you know, Dr. Sajoo is the host of the conversation series on identity, religion, and citizenship, co-sponsored by the Ismaili Center's Canada and Simon Fraser University. His on-stage guests have included such public figures such as John Ralston Saul, Benjamin Berger, Abdullah Dar, Amal Ghazal, and Henry Kim. This has fueled the latest book that he is currently working on about the interface of culture, law, ethics, and faith in the making of modern citizenship. With such interesting topics, let's not waste any more time, and we'll go ahead and hand the session over to Dr. Sajoo.
Plagues. Right in the middle of your screen is the book Piety and Plagues, which nicely captures how we think of our long global history of infection and pandemics. Look at the desperate hands thrown to the skies in the Great Plague of London in 1665 at the top left of your screen. You have a Quaker Christian warning of terrible things to come. And right below him is a painting from the Byzantine plague of the 6th century, where a priest is asking Jesus and the saints to spare the life of a gravedigger. You see him right at the bottom of the picture with his hands around an embalmed corpse. The gravedigger deserves to live, goes the prayer. He's been bearing victims of the plague. Now, on the lower right, you see a discussion panel about how plagues were handled in the Ottoman Empire, centered in Istanbul. The panel is led by the celebrated Turkish writer Orhan Pamuk, who is sitting in the middle, and who is finishing a novel called Plague Nights. Look out for it. It's all about how Muslims, Christians, and others argued about what was actually happening during mass infections. Plagues have been with us since the earliest times, and they feature hugely in the Quran and the Bible. Famously, Egypt's pharaohs were punished for their cruelty to the Jews by 10 waves of plagues. And the Byzantine and Persian empires were hit by a pandemic in the 6th century, which killed an estimated 25 million people. Then there was the Black Death that struck Asia, Europe, and the Middle East in the 14th century. So COVID-19 is part of this very long history. As we approach the modern part of this story, science has explained more and more about the transmission of disease and how to respond effectively. Today, we tend to think that the ethics of how to handle infection, matters of social and individual responsibility like distancing, matters of privacy, how to test vaccines without doing harm to people, that all these are matters of secular codes of conduct built around science. So in pre-modern times, it was all a matter of culture and faith, fear and fatalism. Today, the attitude is that faith and culture just get in the way. When it comes to pilgrimage, for example, and you see a recent one in Mecca at the bottom right of our screen, or just gathering for regular prayers in mosques, Jamaat Khanas, temples and churches, we tend to feel that the right thing to do is a matter of reason, and reason is secular. If it were left to religion, goes the argument, we would ignore the science, and if we got sick and died, well, that's the will of God, inshallah. I want to show in this session of Aspire that there never was a simple black and white view about plagues in the Muslim world. That is the key point in the book you see right in the middle of our screen, Infectious Ideas, by Professor Justin Stearns. From the earliest days, we've had a lively argument that reason and piety or virtue were not separate things, they were tied together. Yes, there were many who insisted that to die in a plague was to be a martyr, shaheed. We still have people who see it that way in all traditions. But the modern view that religion just stands for such fatalism is plain wrong. I want us to go beyond Justin Stearns' wonderful book, which stops in the Middle Ages. And I want to bring us to the modern age, where Muslim communities have often been at the cutting edge of what to do about infection. Our journey, though, starts much earlier. It starts with perhaps the worst pandemic in history, the Great Plague, the Black Death of 1346 to 1353, which is when it hit most of Europe, the Middle East, North Africa. Look at the death toll there on your screen, from a low of 75 million to a high of 200 million. If those numbers are correct, and we have good reason to think that they are based on epidemiological studies, then the Spanish flu of 1918 and what's been happening in more recent times pales in comparison. Furthermore, it was the bacterium, which we later called Yersinia pestis, that gives us the idea of pestilence spread by rodents. Now, this idea that a bacterium, and we now know also viruses, caused pestilence, was completely absent during the Black Death. Instead, the precise cause was thought to be moral revenge. After all, the word plague comes from the Latin plaga, to strike. The Black Death was a massive blow from fate. The term Black Death comes from the Greeks, Homer, the Odyssey, from the Roman Empire, and then from Northern Europe. So this frightening attack, this moral revenge, was the dominant way of understanding the Black Death. By 1347, it hits Cairo. From the east, the Nile is filled with corpses. The Hajj in Mecca is struck. Syria, Palestine, all the way to Andalusia, Muslim Spain, are infected by the Black Death. 1/3 of the population of the Maghreb dies from it. Here is a map. Notice the lines going from east to west. So we reckon that the plague, the Black Death, began in Central Asia in what we would now call China, not the modern People's Republic, but a chunk of East Central Asia, which we would now call China. And it begins in the early 1300s, but it's in the middle 1300s that it really hits Europe and the Middle East. And look at the stretch of it. Right at the top, you've got Dublin, Edinburgh, Scandinavia, and London. And right in the middle, all the way to the west, you've got Marrakesh, you've got Lisbon, and Andalusia in Spain. Goes all the way down to the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. So the Black Death, this massive blow, this plaga, right, is seen by Europeans, by Asians, by people in the Arab and Persian world as something which has moral meaning. And then comes the fascinating part. In Granada, in Muslim Spain, the Vizier Ibn al-Khatib has got this to say about the plague. Remember how early this is. This is the 1340s. And look at what he has to say. It becomes clear to anyone who has diagnosed or treated the disease that individuals who've had contact with the plague will die. Emphasize the word contact. In other words, You actually need physical contact. It's not something that's just going to spring from anywhere. And people who don't have this kind of contact or exposure will not be infected. And then he gives an example of a garment, even an earring that you put in your ear may infect you. And he gives an example that you've got a single house or a given town where it spreads because there is contact. Whereas where there isn't, you won't get infection. So in the middle of the 1300s, a very powerful Muslim scholar and Vizier, he's got political authority now, writes this book, The Muqniyat al-Sa'il, translated, that which satisfies the questioner on the appalling illness. The appalling illness, he wants to say it's a terrible thing. The plague is raging, as he puts it. But he wants to be completely rational about how it's happening. Now look how he follows up on that. So here he wants to say that people in good health who distanced in isolation from the outside world, such as the pious Ibn Abi Madian in Saleh. The pious. Notice he wants to say that he was a virtuous man, a man of character, a man of faith. He believed in contagion. Notice the word belief. In other words, Ibn al-Khatib is not separating faith or piety from being rational. He's now saying that contagion, infection, is done through contact. And if you isolate, if you distance, you sequester, you may not be stricken. The plaga may not happen to you. And he gives another example of entire communities that are free, unscathed from infection because of the distance. And then he even inflects that right at the end there by saying only mildly infectious. This 14th century scholar sounds like a contemporary health advisor. He's talking about degrees of infection. He's talking about contagion versus distancing. He's talking about sequestering or isolation. All the things we would talk about in a modern period. What do we learn from this? In other words, why are we talking about contagion and piety as if these are competing ideas? So here's why. This idea of the transmission of disease, of contagion, in traditional Muslim thought, was felt not to be possible without qadar. So qadar or qadr is God's will. In traditional thought, to suggest that the disease was independently infectious, that it could spread by its own accord, was felt to be a denial that it was done by God's will. In other words, there was a contest. Either it was qadar or qadr, God's will, or the infection was a rational, independent thing that was done without the will of God. In other words, the two were put in competition. Why? Because before Islam, folk belief in the Middle East, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula, is about tiara, evil omens. So tiara is all over folk belief in the pre-Islamic period, and the evil eye, jinns, are thought to be the cause of sickness. If someone gave you the evil eye, we still have this superstition, very common when babies are born, many parts of the world, you want to protect the child from the evil eye. So tiara, this idea that if something happened in the way of sickness, infection, it was because some evil force was looming, was contested in the Quran and the Hadith. That no, that's nonsense. That really, it's not about jinns and the evil eye. It's about the unity of God. It's about Tawheed. God is everywhere. Everything happens by his will. How do we understand this? So in this remarkable hadith, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's extremely well witnessed. It's in all the traditional sources, and I've put them in brackets there. Bukhari and Muslim are the main sources of hadiths, right? And they quote the Prophet as saying, if you hear of a plague in a land, do not go into it. If it happens in land where you are, do not go out of it. How could the Prophet in the 7th century, long before science, long before Yersinia pestis, the idea of the bacterium, be saying that there is this contagion that might happen? Is it really about contagion? Was it about science? Was it about something else? Right after the hadith, you get a huge intellectual quarrel that comes out of hadith interpretation. And again, many of you will be familiar with it, the Asharis versus the Mutazilis. So the Asharis are the great traditionalists. Perhaps the most famous of the Asharis is Al-Ghazali. So the Asharis want to say that the reason the Prophet said that you shouldn't go into a land which has a plague, and if you already are in a land where there is plague, don't go out of it. The reason the Prophet said that was because you must always submit to the will of God. In other words, if the blow, plaga, struck people in a particular land, then the will of God, qadar, is about that place, those people, that community. Don't mess with it, don't interfere, stay out of it. And it happens to you, to where you are. It was God's will. Don't be a moral coward and flee from it. That's the Ashari interpretation. The Mutazilis, who believe in free will, are very strong in Basra, in Iraq, spread very widely in the Shi'i tradition, but are also strong amongst liberal Sunnis. The Mutazilis reply, oh, what nonsense. God has given us aql. He's given us reason. And because he's given us reason, we have the burden of responsibility to avoid harm. And what the Prophet was saying in that hadith, say the Mutazilis, is straightforward. If there is a plague and there is trouble, then just as you would avoid trouble anywhere else, be sensible, take responsibility, do not go into that troubled place. It's morally and practically irresponsible. Conversely, if you happen to be where it's happening, why do you want to spread that trouble? In other words, be responsible, fight the plague where you are, take responsible measures. Don't be a coward, like the Asharis say, not because you need to resign yourself to the will of God. On the contrary, it's because you need to use your reason, show solidarity, and help your family and your community to fight the plague. So you get this major 9th century, 10th century development of the Ashari versus the Mutazilis, coming right of the earliest foundational period of Islam. In other words, the response to the plague becomes part of this intellectual tradition of how do we interpret moral responsibility? Now, you might think, okay, this is amongst intellectuals, this is so elitist. What does it have to do with ordinary people? Here's the answer. In practical terms, we have this Muslim idea of tahara. Tahara is so important, cleanliness, that we have wudu before you go to prayer, Surah Ma'idah, Quran 5:6. Before you go into prayer, cleanse yourself. If you were in a marketplace, even in Mecca and Medina in the time of the Prophet, already we had regulation of marketplaces. Why? Because people going into a market, the public, were to have their well-being, their physical well-being preserved. So if you were a seller in a marketplace, you were responsible for the spread of disease. You must do everything possible to make sure that your product was clean. It didn't matter whether you were an Ashari or a Mutazili. Still early days, but you couldn't fall into a camp of fatalism or reason. You had to get with the program. You had to listen to the health regulation. What I'm saying is that there is an intellectual idea that piety and reason must be combined, must be understood as part of Tawheed, as part of the same universe of faith. But there was also a practical sense from Tahara, from this Quranic principle of cleansing, that, as the Prophet puts it right at the bottom of your screen in the Hadith, cleanliness is half of faith. There is no way with that Hadith that you're going to be able to argue that public health, that watching for infection or preserving your health is not about faith. They are now put together. And so we come to Justin Stern's critical point about the development of the Muslim intellectual tradition. And look what he says in that first paragraph, that Islamic law is not about exhortations and prescriptions alone. It's about ethical and moral discourse, arguments in which you do what? You balance justice and mercy, on the one hand, God's intention, with preserving the public good. The practical element is read right into the law, into what we think of as religious law, Sharia, right? Fiqh. And so Stearns goes on to say, when framing a response to somebody's query about plague and contagion, what the Muslim jurist, and Muslim jurists were not the Supreme Court of Mecca or Medina or Damascus or Cairo. These were ordinary imams of local mosques, right? They were muftis. They were people that looked after a particular community. If they had to issue an opinion, what we call a fatwa, they had two separate responsibilities which came into being, into play together. One was the physical and spiritual well-being of the person requesting the opinion, the questioner, but also the broader social consequences. You could never isolate the individual from the community. That separation is very much a modern and particularly a Western concept. So look at the final thing that Stearns wants to say, that in addition to the framework of law, right, when you look at relevant Quranic verses and the hadiths, right, they were authoritative, but interpretation was everything. That's why you had legal schools, madhab, right? You had the four Sunni schools, you had the Shia Jafari school, you had Ismaili interpretations coming out of particularly the Fatimid period after the 10th century, right? It goes back earlier, of course, to Imam Jafar Sadiq, but is hugely developed in Fatimid Cairo. So what Stearns is doing for us here is he's framing this early Muslim period and saying that there was no way that you could talk about good Islam, public virtue, and not talk about vice in the practical sense. In other words, you're being careless about public health, about responsibility. It didn't matter whether you were an Ash'ari or a Mu'tazili. Those arguments were intellectually very important, but what really mattered was interpretation. Now, I want to connect this to the larger global picture. In other words, I don't want us to see what's happening in the Muslim world. After all, we were looking at Ibn al-Khatib in Andalusia, Muslim Spain. But as you know, by 1492, Muslim Spain becomes Catholic Spain. We're now connecting Mediterranean history that is Muslim and also Christian and Jewish and other things as well. You've got pagan beliefs too. So the starting point for the modern understanding of contagion, of infection, is this Italian guy, Girolamo Fracastoro, because Italy, like Spain, is still suffering the legacy of the Black Death. Remember that 14th century horror. In the 1500s, most people still believe in what I'm referring to there at the bottom of that bullet point, miasma, which is a fancy word for poisonous swamps and vapors. Now, there's a certain practical logic to this, which is that where you've got dirt and muddy patches and swamps, you are likely to have health problems, malaria as we know today, and so on. So people thought that where you have miasma, where you have these vapors and swamps, you have infection. It was a very blunt weapon to use against the plague, that if you just clean these things up, everything would be fine. Fracastoro says no, there are actually particles which spread infectious diseases. So for the first time in 1546, in the Western tradition, which is now going to affect Christian Europe, for the very first time in 1546, we have germ theory. Let's go back for a moment. Ibn al-Khatib, the 1340s, 200 years before Fracastoro, has already come up with his intuition that infection is spread by contact and reduced by isolation and distancing. So notice the connection here and the overlap. Germ theory as a scientific idea is going to come from the 16th century onwards, after the 1540s. It fights against people resisting it and calling it miasma, not accepting Fracastoro's theory, but now we're getting the beginning of science. But already we had that 200 years earlier in Andalusia and then spreading across North Africa in the Muslim tradition. All right, so this is picked up by somebody that most of us know from our school, Louis Pasteur in Paris. Pasteur is the first person to say that Fracastoro's particles are not just chemical dead particles, they are microorganisms. This is real germ theory now. So in 1862, we have a milestone. This is the beginning of the modern understanding of disease. So Pasteur in Paris wants to say that if you want to stop infection, you need to go after microorganisms, the infectors, which he can now see, and you can see that in the graphic, in a microscope. Now, the story continues in an extraordinary way, because one of the disciples of Pasteur, one of the people that works at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, is this Russian guy who happens to be Jewish, Waldemar Hafkin. So Waldemar Hafkin has become a legend because he developed the vaccine against cholera using Pasteur's germ theory. So we're now connecting Hafkin with this great tradition of germ theory going back to Fracastoro. And Hafkin now hears about something terrible happening in Paris about Bombay. So Bombay is hit in 1896, 1897 by the bubonic plague. It comes from Hong Kong. As far as we know, that's the most precise epidemiological accounts that we have, that it came south into India from Hong Kong through travel and visitors and so on. So when Hafkin hears about this, he goes to British-controlled India, to Bombay. The British are happy for him to go and see if he can do something about the bubonic plague, because they are responsible for health measures in Bombay. They are hopelessly irresponsible about it. Like the people around Ibn al-Khatib in Andalusia, the British in Bombay still subscribe to some vague idea about, oh, well, if we just have social hygiene and avoid miasmas, everything will be fine. And here is Mr. Hafkin saying, wait a minute, it's not that simple. We need to do something about a vaccine, which means getting very serious about it. Now, how does Hafkin develop this vaccine against the bubonic plague? And he does, and he puts a stop to it. The answer is remarkable. But first, let's have a look at some pictures. So at the top left of your screen are scenes from Bombay. Look at the poverty in this part of Bombay. So the two pictures on the left that I've combined show you inspectors there in uniform coming into a neighborhood. And at the far top left, you see how fragile the living conditions would be and how easily the plague would spread in that part of Bombay. Now look at the far right of your picture. This is a very well-to-do family in Bombay that has been displaced. They're living in private tents, as you can see, very much like what we would call quarantine today. So In comes Hafkin into this situation. Now let's look at the bottom panel. Let's look at the left first. So that's a Bombay hospital. You can see the distancing happening in the hospital. The beds are spread out. It's a privileged hospital. Now, moving on from left to right, bottom panel, that picture there, I'm sorry it's hazy, but it's a classic picture from the 19th century. And in that picture, what you're seeing, I know the print is difficult to read, that is Hafkin with his vaccine, and he is doing public inoculations of himself and anybody who will volunteer to come and get the vaccine. So this is now 1897, 1898. He has developed the vaccine, he wants to spread it. Now we get to the really interesting part. So bottom picture, second right, there is Hafkin sitting in a certain place called Khushru Lodge. Do you want to guess where Khushru Lodge comes from? Yes, many of you know. It was owned by Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah. It was one of his houses. So Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah strikes a friendship with Hafkin. We'll see the quote from the memoirs in a moment. I want you to see the physical picture there. Do you see how spacious that place is where Hafkin is working? That is a privileged space, a lab, fully financed and equipped by Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah, so that the bubonic plague vaccine can be developed quickly. And that last picture at the bottom right, as most of you know, of course, is the 20-year-old Imam. That's how old he is in 1897 when he's chatting with Hafkin. You've got a 20-year-old religious leader who is now advising Hafkin and the British on what to do about the plague in Bombay. So here we go, from the memoirs. Look at this moving quote at page 38. I knew, says the Imam, that I must take the initiative because nobody else is doing it. He knew of Pasteur's work in France. Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah was familiar with Louis Pasteur's work, which we saw earlier, and he talks directly to Hafkin. Look at the way he phrases it. I could at least give him facilities, sense of responsibility. And look at his gentle rebuke to the British government of India, right? Until the government of India are convinced of the success of his methods, they need to be told what to do. It takes them 2 years to get to the point and officially finance what he is doing. All right, let's move on. So here is the Imam's fear about what the plague might do. The impact of the plague among my own people, that's Ismailis, Muslims at large. It was in my power to set an example. So what did he do? He goes public. He is vaccinated over and over again with Hafkin in public right across Bombay, and he takes care to see the news of what he has done is spread quickly. Remember, there's no Facebook, there's no Twitter, there's no social media, so he physically has to go to every possible site, all those poor places we saw in that earlier graphic, so that first Ismailis, my followers could see that I, their Imam, had in fact, in full view of witnesses, submitted myself, now key term, this dreaded process. Why a dreaded process? People feared the vaccine. They still thought that if they got the vaccine, it would kill them. Now, before you think, oh, how superstitious, remember the anti-vaxxers we have today. We still have people in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in fact, mostly in the developed world, who don't take vaccines seriously. Well, this is the situation in 1897, 1898 in Bombay. So the Imam goes around getting jabbed with Hafkin. Ismailis immediately follow this practical advice, and then it spreads in the community. Okay, I now want to connect Granada and Bombay. What do they have in common? Because I'm trying to show that we've got a tradition, that these are not freak happenings, that Ibn al-Khatib and Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah, right, and the Mutazilis are not weird, freak, progressive figures in an otherwise backward, socially retarded community or set of communities who want to resist this. In fact, That's the point of Justine Stern's book. Because what he wants to do is to say, Western scholars take Ibn al-Khatib and Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah to be outliers. In other words, that they did something unusual. Well, yes, it was unusual. They took the initiative, but they were not alone. They were part of a progressive group of people right from the outset who thought something had to be done. In the face of your first bullet point here, that official responses were inadequate. Now, a quick point, which is that al-Khatib's response is long before Fracastori's germ theory, and that the word pious is so common in al-Khatib's writing. He wants to combine responsibility and piety and rational distancing. He does not think that they belong in separate compartments. The same goes with Hafkin's vaccine development, right? Both Hafkin and Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah face resistance. Hafkin faces resistance because even the medical community does not buy quite yet vaccine and germ theory. They're still confused. They still don't think that those particles of Fracastoro are actually microorganisms. They haven't even caught up with Louis Pasteur. So there is plenty of resistance to go. And even after the success of the vaccine, as we have today, you've got conservative opinions in elite secular and religious communities that think of the plague as either random or divine rage. All right, so what is the legacy of this? What are we getting at? To begin with, notice, as I'm saying here in the first bullet point, the Prophet himself, a huge example in accounts of the Prophet's Medina particularly, but also Mecca. Leprosy was very common. How should early Muslims respond to leprosy when it was so common? There is a wonderful duality to it. On the one hand, the Prophet is known to have eaten food often with lepers, to have blessed them, to have welcomed them into the community, but also to have said people should be very careful about exposure to untreated bodies, limbs, etc., because that was not the way of God, because you had a responsibility to be careful. Now, here is an extraordinarily interesting tangential point coming out of this, which is information, because as we know, misinformation is a very common thing. So, moving for a second away from plagues, you had a similar problem of flooding in Egypt, which was also a land of plagues. So in Fatimid Cairo, 10th and 11th centuries, the Nile floods were very common. And people engaged in freewheeling rumor, as we do now on Facebook and Twitter and so on. They would spread information about the floods exactly as they would about pandemics. So what did the Fatimids do? One, they invested in the Nilometer. The Nilometer was a scientific way of being able to judge the rising and falling of the waters of the Nile. So number one, they wanted hard data. Number two, they wanted to control what was real information and fake news. So they had an official policy of what information was legitimate, halal information, and haram information, right? What's kosher, what's not. So already you've got this tradition of information is important, be responsible with it. All right, moving on. Turkish baths. The whole idea of a public bath comes from the Ottoman Empire. So if you read Orhan Pamuk's book that I was telling you about earlier on, you see how Turkish baths then spread across the Mediterranean and into Europe. This idea, there we go again, tahara, right? That idea of cleanliness comes from this idea of public baths and public hygiene. Now I want to get to where this is going here, which is that when it comes to congregations, gathering for prayer, for socializing, and so on, and for pilgrimage, the Hajj, a really important underlying issue is exoteric versus esoteric. If you think that your community is first esoteric, then the community continues to be a community even if you don't have a physical gathering, because what matters are the underlying values. If you emphasize too much the exoteric part of the community and your values and your beliefs, then the pain of the physical breaking of the community, which is inevitable in a plague, is going to be much greater, and the consequences will be much greater. So the modern history of the Hajj, look at that. 3 modern waves of plagues stopped the Hajj. You've got 1837 to 1840, again 1846 to 1850, waves of cholera, 1858, yet another one. So the current debate that we have of whether people should be allowed even to go to the Hajj, it's still up in the air. There is some discouragement coming from Saudi Arabia, but only for people outside of Saudi Arabia, as if you gathered and you were Saudi, then it would be okay. So the more esoteric your understanding of the Hajj and the pilgrimage and of gatherings, the more relaxed you're going to be about it. So I want to now hasten to add that Muslims don't have an exclusive patent on this idea that piety and reason are combined. I'm saying that in the Muslim world, this combination has gone back right to the origins. But there are such traditions elsewhere. So I have those 2 amazing graphics for you here, both from just a couple of weeks ago. So in Berlin, at the Martha Lutheran Church, out of compassion for the diaspora Muslim community in Berlin, the Friday prayer is conducted in a church. And at bottom right, you see a Catholic gathering in Munich, again in Germany, and notice the distancing. You've got all the rituals being performed, got a priest there, so on, officiating, and notice the distancing being practiced. That again, piety and reason are not enemies. And of course, with AKDN, all you have to do is go to the website, the AKDN website, click Global Pandemic Relief Fund, and there's an invitation for all of us, Ismaili, Muslim, non-Muslim, everybody, secular, and so on, to contribute to that pandemic relief fund. And then look at the list of things being done. I hope the print is not too small for your screen. That you've got solidarity expressed from the bottom, Bangladesh to Afghanistan, right? To parts of East Africa, to the Aga Khan Hospital in Karachi. You've got an activist response to the pandemic. It's not mere observation saying, ooh la la, we have to be following official orders. It's we are part of the official response. It's not somebody else just telling us what to do. I want to come to the end of this with a wonderful quote from the founding of the Aga Khan Hospital, from the inauguration at which our Imam, Aga Khan IV, in 1985 has this to say. First, notice that he begins with tradition, al-Kindi. So this is back in the 10th century. No one is diminished by the truth. The truth is, in other words, not religious or secular. It's both. And that intellectual inquiry and spirituality are not separate travelers. And then he's got this gorgeous anecdote about Ibn Sina, right? And Abu Khair, both of them Sufis. And Ibn Sina wants to say, whatever I know, God sees. And Abu Sa'id replies, whatever I see, he knows. Knowledge, perception, experience. That they belong to Tawheed, this single holistic universe. They're not separate. Well, I want to end with a set of references in case you're interested. I've got a list of major sources from which we derive a lot of this information that we have here.
Dr. Sajoo, you really have given us a lot to think about, especially considering everything that is going on and how all of our lives have really sort of changed in the past 8 to 10 weeks or so.
Well, it's infectious ideas, right?
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. I think we're all going to take everything back from this and really, really sort of ponder over it and think how, we can apply it to our everyday lives now, especially going forward. With that being said, we've gotten quite a few questions, both in terms of how the Muslim response was back during the bubonic plague, and from bioethics, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and try to consolidate this for everybody. And I'm going to start with going into history a little bit. Now, if individuals like Al-Khatib back in the 1340s and Islam Sultan Muhammad Shah in the late 1800s and other Mutazilites were part of the progressive Muslim tradition, in other words, they weren't really alone, as you say, can you point to a specific or tangible point of this evidence in like a larger rational tradition?
Now, to your wonderful question, Maria, that if we're claiming that these progressives were not alone, which has been Western scholarship has insisted that these were just, unusual freak experiences and they do not represent a backward Muslim world. Well, if that is true, how do we handle this? The tradition of medicine beginning in the 10th century. So Islamic medicine, the first hospitals in the world, in fact, the original term for hospital is Bimaristan from the Persian. The earliest recorded hospitals in the world were in Iran. Now, yes, they preceded the Islamic period, but it's in the Islamic period that the Bimaristan becomes a full-fledged institution, and then it spreads. So there's a very famous one in Damascus. And I particularly like the story about the Damascus hospital because the great Al-Razi was practicing there. And there is this amazing thing we hear on the walls of the Damascus hospital when Razi was the chief medical officer on the main floor. They had a patient bill of rights on the wall. In the 13th century, there's a patient bill of rights in Damascus. This does not happen in the West for another half a millennium. The idea that patients have rights, not just the practitioners. So what I'm getting at is that already you've got a culture which is progressive. A hospital does not spring out of miasma. A hospital comes out of a progressive scientific environment. And then there is the Mansouriya in Cairo in the 1200s. It's got a mental health ward. In the 1200s, people with mental health issues are not dumped in an asylum. They're treated gently in a hospital. The Ottoman Empire had a hospital for leprosy, while Westerners were putting them in leper colonies. So what I'm getting at is that in the Ottomans, in the Fatimid period, in the Abbasid period, right, all the way out to the east of the Muslim world, you've already got very sophisticated cultures of medicine. They're cutting edge. Ibn al-Haytham, under the Fatimids, develops the theory of optics. Without al-Haytham, there are no lenses. Without lenses, there's no microscope. In other words, the entire foundation for modern medicine is laid out across the Muslim Mediterranean in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. And of course, we know the great textbook of medicine is written by Ibn Sina, the Qanun fi Tib. So there is a very powerful culture of progressive Muslim practice. And also, just coming down to earth a little bit, remember what I said at the beginning. If you went to a marketplace, no one cared if you had a PhD, in philosophy and you were a Mutazili or you were a laid-back Ashari. If you went into a marketplace, there were health rules. This was most unusual. In other words, there was a sense of social responsibility to make sure that people bought clean potatoes, clean vegetables, and so on already, which is the beginning of health regulation and then controlling infection. So there is nothing freakish about it. It's a very strong tradition. Remember also the Red Cross in the Muslim world is the Red Crescent. So even in the modern period, why not just the Red Cross? Because they want to say we have a tradition of public welfare, public healthcare institutions, and they want to call it the Red Crescent. So there is a very lively progressive tradition.
Wow. Wow, that really makes us think that, Muslims, or at least, Islamic healthcare was really sort of at the forefront when these plagues were going on in history. But that's a great point. I know a lot of us are probably going to go back and Google some more of this information.
Oh, please do, yes.
So now moving on, I want to kind of make sure we get as many questions in as possible. A lot of the questions that have come up for a variety of things, but one of the questions that did come up was about biomedical ethics. It's a big question and it's very difficult to answer. So one of the ones is, on our biomedical ethics today, especially during this current COVID-19 pandemic, the protocols that are involved about testing, safety, vaccine development, and so on, which are based on the best science. How do we reconcile that with religion, specifically, Ismailism, and then Islam as a whole, as a more broader religious area?
Okay, so when you say protocols, the impression we tend to have as well, a protocol comes out of a lab, it comes out of the chief health officer, and of course it must be secular. So therefore, what does religion have to do with it? Why are we talking about faith here, whether it's Judaism or Christianity or Islam? The trouble is, we're forgetting that a protocol is an expression, a practical, immediate expression of rules which comes out of ethical principles. For example, if you're a doctor, then two of the most important principles in your practice are going to be consent. Right? Consent is going to be completely crucial. And another one is going to be do no harm. Okay. Now, based on do no harm and based on patient consent, which must be informed, okay, based on that, you get a protocol. So unless you have, first of all, an underlying ethical principle, where's the protocol going to come out of? The reason we've got a protocol in a lab to say, if you don't wear your PPE, your personal protection equipment, you don't wear your suit and your mask and your gloves, you can't go into a particular lab, is because the underlying principle is do no harm. Make sure the person coming in is fully informed. In other words, out of those ethical principles, you get a protocol. So we tend to get hypnotized by the razzmatazz of the protocol. We think, oh, this sounds like technical English. What does it have to do with religion? Everything. No protocol, no ethical principles come only out of science. They come out of science and the social understanding of the individual, where we locate science, and so on. So as I was saying, in the Damascus hospital in the 12 and 1300s, you've got a Bill of Rights for patients. Also, the do no harm, the Hippocratic Oath, Hellenic medicine is all part of the Muslim heritage. They take it on board. They don't say, oh, well, this is Greek and there were Christians or pagans or whatever, and we're different. No, it's good science. And no one said there was Islamic bioethics. I find that fascinating. That's what we say today. For them, it was just ethics. They were not conscious that they were putting an Islamic color or an Islamic canvas on it. They just thought this was the appropriate thing to do. And the appropriate thing is not packaged into secular versus religious. If something is appropriate, such as distancing, it doesn't matter whether your package is labeled secular or religious. It's just appropriate. So I think the excellent question about protocols and, is it all secular, is based on the false premise that we are going to define everything one way or the other. That's why I gave you that quote at the end from Al-Kindi via Hazar Imam, right? And he says that the truth from Al-Kindi, 10th century, is so precious, right? It is spiritual, it is scientific, it's objective, and so on. It's the truth. So the ethical rules are going to come out of culture, social understanding, faith. That is a deeply important part. By the way, I just saw someone saying in the chat that, well, he's telling us that way back in the past, Muslims were cutting edge and we did wonderful things and we helped develop microscopes and so on, and germ theory, blah, blah, blah. But look at us today. Well, the trouble with that argument is, who is the us? If you buy the mainstream media story, then you get the feeling, because you always highlight people who are bad, whether in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in Asia, anywhere, it's the bad news that makes the headlines, right? But the truth of the matter is that there is a hell lot of resistance to the bad guys, and it's all over the place.
I mean, I'm glad with the way you actually led into that, because a lot of it seems like, that this happened back in the past with the different plagues that happened, but especially now, the whole dynamic of community has changed, right? And I've seen a lot of questions that have been coming through that what's the best way to figure out the actual facts of what's going on, and how does this change our relationship with everyone? Because, just as we're having this conversation now, and here we are now, we have people from all over the world, and we're having this conversation that's applicable all over the world. So here's the question that it seems like that's kind of coming through, especially now, given our heavy reliance on digital communication during this COVID-19 pandemic. We're having this virtual session, and religious communities are now generally relying on video-based connection. Could this be long-term? Could this really redefine how we look at community, like what community actually means?
Absolutely. And I think that applies whether you're exoteric or esoteric. So even amongst the exoterics, people who feel that the physical thing is so important and so on. So just the news of the past couple of days, Indonesia and Singapore are now going to have a severe restriction of people going to the Hajj. Now, Indonesia and Singapore, and their decisions were made by the religious departments. They were not made by some secular guys in a lab telling everyone what to do, right? There were fatwas about it, and they were saying, no, it's not appropriate. Now, here is the interesting thing. Indonesia is not a rich country. People saved for years to go to the Hajj. They lined up to get a visa. It's a very big, it's the world's largest Muslim country. And there's a big lineup for it. And here you are now telling people, sorry, tough luck, the bug got in the way, and you're not going to Saudi Arabia. Okay. And Singapore officially has banned it. How are you going to respond to this? So if you are a person with a deep emotional, spiritual investment in going to the Hajj, you have to come to terms with it over the next year, at least. So all these people have now been jumped up to 2021. So it seems to me that they will have to construct a new narrative now. What are we going to do about the Hajj? I refuse to believe for a second that they're just going to say, oh, tough luck, we'll wait for next year. That's not the way human beings operate. We're not robots. They're going to have to reason with their local sheikh, with the local imam, with the local mufti, with the religious department. Schools will talk about it. In other words, they will reconstruct the Hajj. They will have to think, what should we do? It goes virtual. During the Eid, just a couple of weeks ago, right across the Muslim world, celebration, including in Saudi Arabia, by the way, celebrations went virtual. So people were doing the namaz, they were doing the prayers, they were doing iftar, they were doing, a whole bunch of rituals, including family festivities and so on, virtual. They have to invest meaning in that. Community has to be redefined. We are reconstructing community in very deep ways, and in many ways, the bonds are really important. We have to find rational and pious ways, not to replace that, but to rethink it. So it becomes larger. It doesn't become smaller.
That's a great answer. And, given if we look at our Ismaili history, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 400 years ago, now you're right. We've redefined what it means to be a community, because all these communities didn't necessarily have a center for congregation. Now here we are with over 600 people, and I'm sure they're from all across the globe, all across the United States and Canada and the UK and all that. And here we are having this conversation that we never really thought we would have. I think for all of us here, this is something really thought-provoking. I certainly hope that everybody that's on the session today, takes what Dr. Sajoo has given us today and, really internalize it, and take a look at how Muslims in general have really contributed to the progression of science, the progression of healthcare, to where we are now. And in terms of how, different communities, different countries and cities and states are really responding to take care of their own populations. Now, it looks like we are running out of time. Just want to say, first of all, Dr. Sajoo, thank you so much.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. Many, many thanks. And the very engaging remarks, the questions, they're brilliant. And thank you for asking me to do this. So it's taken me on a journey as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, with that being said, again, thank you, Dr. Sajoo. Again, thank you, everybody, for joining us. We are ending our time now. I just wanted to let you know that this Aspire session, these educational sessions will continue. And we'd hope that you would like to join us for ITREB Canada and USA, who will be bringing Dr. Zul Hirji and Rahim Rajan on this week's episode of Critical Conversations. It's a virtual forum featuring faith-based perspectives on important questions of our time. Tune in this Sunday, that's May 31st, at 10 p.m. West Coast Pacific time and 1 p.m. Eastern time to hear their take on the topic, Diversity in Islam, a faith of many faces. We hope you're able to join us there, and inshallah, we'll be able to continue more sessions like this. Again, Dr. Sajoo, thank you very, very much. I know we're all very appreciative, and we're going to be thinking about this a lot. And for everyone that joined, thank you again. And please, continue to ask your questions and look into Dr. Sajoo's research and references that he did provide. Stay safe, everybody, and we will hopefully contact you soon and see you on our next session.
Stay safe and connected.